All right, everyone, if you want to come back in, grab your snacks, coffee, grab a seat. For those of you who are in here, I was a youth pastor for years, which is fun, so I'll have to do some games here in a little bit. But as you're coming back, how about Dale Peterson and his wisdom over the years and his... Thanks, Dale. He's shaking his head. No, he hates that. Sorry. I always like to joke, that if Dale were to take his shirt off, he would have a lot of scars from his leadership over the years. But I want to kick off with telling you a little about me. So my name's Aaron Demianovich, and I mentioned I've been on staff at Eaglebrook Church it'll be over 13 years. I've been around for about 16, started attending Eaglebrook in college when I started dating a girl by the name of Ashley, who is now my wife, because Eaglebrook was her family church. So that's how I started coming, and then I started serving, volunteering, and then eventually got hired on as on staff. And when I first started, I was a youth pastor, and it was a dream job for me to work at Eaglebrook. And I got to be a youth pastor student ministries for 3 years. And then one day I got a call from our leadership team and asked me if I wanted to be the campus pastor to go launch a new campus in an old high school in Coon Rapids, Minnesota. And I could not believe, I was not expecting that. I was 26 years old, me, what? And then it was funny that the phone call was more like, hey, we're launching this campus. We are thinking of you. Would you be interested in throwing your name in the hat? And then by the end of the phone call, it was, oh, and by the way, you'll start this day. Here's when we're launching. It was like, all right, I guess. So we did that, and it was absolutely incredible. We launched in a high school. We were in a high school for 3 years, and then we bought an old Kmart and renovated it to become a campus. And when we launched, we went from a high school. We were averaging 1,000 people in a high school over 2 services, which was awesome. And then the next weekend, when we went to a permanent site, over 6,500 people showed up. And it was 5 minutes away from the high school. It was like a God amazing thing. And I loved that job. And then I got asked to become the central director of student ministries. So at Eaglebrook, I went from campus and I got to lead 6th through 12th grade for all of Eaglebrook, and I did that for 4 years, and did a lot of teaching and preaching on Wednesdays. Got to lead the youth pastors at all our different campuses, and then 3 years ago, Dale asked me to join the Eaglebrook Association, and I love what I get to do now. It's incredible. As you all know, when you're working for a church and in a church, you're so focused on your church, which is awesome, and sometimes you lose sight of what God is doing everywhere else. And one of my favorite things about what I get to do is see how the kingdom of God is working around the country and the world. And it's humbling to be up here, but it's such an honor to see what God is doing. But I didn't grow up in church. I was not a Christian. I grew up in northern Minnesota in an area called the Iron Range. Is anyone familiar with the Iron Range? Fantastic. Oh, you have a Minnesota shirt on. That's fantastic. Represent. So I grew up on the Iron Range, went to a high school called Greenway High School, and where I grew up, they breed you for hockey. So ice hockey is it is a hockey town. So growing up, hockey was my God. That is what I live for. I played hockey. My parents, I didn't grow up in church. My parents didn't go to church. I lived for hockey. After I graduated from high school, I got drafted by a junior A team in Billings, Montana, to go play junior hockey. So I went out to play junior hockey, and what's crazy about the junior hockey world is you spend most of your life on a bus traveling. So we were constantly on the road, traveling, from game to game to game. And because I grew up in this small town in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, I didn't read books at all. And like honestly, I graduated from high school without reading an entire book. People think I'm joking or I'm like a speaker that's embellishing. Never read a book in my life. So I decided, like, okay, I can only listen to, the old, what was the old Apple one? Like the iPod with the little circle thing? I can only listen to so much like Eminem and Tupac. So I decided I want to start reading some books. And I randomly went to a bookstore in Billings, and I just was walking the aisles, and I just like randomly saw, oh, there's just a bunch of like 12 books. That'll be interesting. I'll just buy the first couple. And I happened to buy the Left Behind series. And I am an unchurched, non-Christian hockey player who is now reading the Left Behind series. So I'm reading these books, and I would say, to this day, it's like they started to scare me into this Jesus thing. So, and they're really good if you ever read them. I mean, they're page turners. So I started telling the family, you live with a billet family, the family I lived with about these books and what I'm reading, and they're like, hey, you should go check out this church. And my first thought was, why would I do that? Like, my only church experience was with my grandma in Keewatin, Minnesota, and it was like a really small, it was right across from the playground. I'm like, I'd rather be there. Like, why would I go? Because that's, a lot of people, when you invite them to church, they have a category of what church is. And I'm like, why would I go to? They're like, no, seriously, I think you would like it. And I'm like, okay. Well, I went to that church, and it was the first time in my life where I got to experience God in some way. I remember as I drove up to the church, it was very similar to this place. It was like there were people guiding traffic and parking, and I remember thinking, they look like they want to be at church. They're having fun. They're dressed normal. And I was like in a suit. That's when you know someone is new. They show up with a suit, and if it's a tie, it's like, oh, you've never been here before. And I walk in, and they, there's like coffee, and I had this moment like, oh, and at that church it was like free, and they're like, oh, here's some coffee, and then I get to like, the worship center auditorium, and you stop, and you're like, can I bring this in here? And they're like, yeah, just go on in there. And I walked in there, and then the worship started. And I remember being like, wow, they're actually good. The music is good. And it was engaging. But I'll never forget the message, because it was the first time in my life where I heard a message, like the gospel communicated and presented in a way that like spoke to my life. And this was in 2007, and I still remember the whole message that pastor preached to this day, because it was the first time I heard the gospel. Well, I go back to my team, and now I'm the dude in the locker room who was like, hey, you got to come to this church. And they're like, what is wrong with you? And I got like probably 10 guys to come to church with me the next week, and then about 5 of us just kept going the rest of the year. And what's crazy is, like, if you know anything about the junior hockey culture, it's not where people go to find Jesus. You find a lot of other things, and I could tell you stories, but then I'd probably get fired. But like, God found me is a better way to put it. And I would say I started to believe in God, but I didn't necessarily want to make him my Lord. Well, I went back home over the summer. My parents, moved to a smaller town. And my mom at the time, she had a disease called MS, so multiple sclerosis. And she was diagnosed when I was born. And over the years, throughout like middle school and high school, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. So throughout high school, my mom, she started with like walking with a limp, and then eventually, couldn't walk, had to, have a walker, and then a cane, walker, and then ended up in a wheelchair. But it didn't, affect her brain, her mind. It was just her legs and her like right arm or her left arm. And I remember going home, and I started telling my parents, like, hey, let's start going to church. So I got to invite my mom to church, and there was a church right across the street, actually in the little town of Reamer. There were 4 churches, a town of 300 people, and they were all on the same intersection. So there was this one church on the one corner. I went to that one first, and I'm like, not for me. The neighbor behind us was a Catholic church. Across the street was a Pentecostal church. And then sharing grass with the Pentecostal church was a Lutheran church. And I went to the Pentecostal church, and I'm like, these people love Jesus. So I'm like, this is my place, right? It was fantastic. So we walked across the street. My mom buzzed across with her scooter. We started going to this Pentecostal church, and they had a moment where it was like the old-fashioned altar call, put your faith in Jesus, and my mom and I both went up together and put our faith in Christ. And it changed my life. It was like a Paul on Damascus Road for me. Up to that point, I was going to go to the Air Force Academy, play D1 hockey, study aeronautical engineer, be a pilot, and now I'm like, my whole life, all I could think about was Jesus. I remember going back home, opening up the Bible, reading it, and having a thought, why has no one ever told me this before? And it was just like the Spirit was doing something in my life. And then I got traded to a different team in Kearney, Nebraska. So I went out there, and all I wanted to do was talk about Jesus and go to church. Like hockey, I didn't even really care about it anymore. And then I got traded again, and now I'm back in Billings, 7 months after my mom and I put our faith in Jesus. And I remember, I was on the phone with her, and she was like, I can't wait one day to be with God where I can run again, where I can walk again. Well, 7 months later, I get a call from my dad at 6 a.m., and he was just like, Aaron, and he's crying. I'm like, what's going on? And he was like, your mom just had a heart attack, and she didn't make it. And as a new believer, as an 18-year-old, right, I just heard my mom passed away. The first thing I felt was joy and peace, which is really hard to explain. And my dad's like, I need you back here. So I flew back to Minnesota. And during that season, God used me to minister to my family, to minister to my dad, to minister to my brother, my uncles. And it was at my mom's funeral where I turned to the pastor and I said, I feel like God is calling me to be a pastor. And he's like, yeah, I think so too. And then that's what led me to Bethel University, where all I wanted to do was study. I didn't know anything about the Bible. I wanted to study the Bible, got to play hockey there for fun, and it was fantastic. And that's what led to Eagle Brook. But what I love about this is, like Dale said, Jesus gave the church the mission in Matthew 28. Go and make disciples. And oftentimes, being in this role, I'm often surprised at how the church in general, they separate evangelism from discipleship. But they'll talk about discipleship as discipleship is making believers better believers. But when Jesus said, go and make disciples, what's the first step of that? It's go and share the gospel, preach the gospel. Because once they become a believer, now you baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Why? Because Jesus died for them. And don't forget, while you were sinners, Jesus died for you. So because of love, let's go reach lost people. That's the mission of the church. And I'm even so bold to say, if the mission of the church isn't something to do with making disciples and reaching lost people, then you're not a church, you're a Christian nonprofit. Doing very, very good, important things. But the church's mission is to reach lost people, baptizing them and then teaching them to obey. Obey what? The marks of a disciple, right? And that's what Dale said, like these 5 things. And oftentimes, like most of the things that we do, that disciples do, we've noticed fall under one of those buckets. Serving others isn't just serving at church. It's you want to serve your family. You want to serve locally. You want to serve globally, right? And then ultimately helping people believe. So that was my journey. It was like I came to know Jesus, put my faith in Christ, and I started to experience the love of God, started to work on my relationships with others, got baptized, and then it took me a while to start to understand, now I'm a disciple, like, what does that even mean? How do my actions align with my beliefs, right? It's not just behaviors for behaviors, it's behaviors motivated by our love for God. And ultimately, at Bethel, I started to learn beliefs, and then, I went to seminary and got my master's, and it takes a while to learn those things, but there was a church on mission, and it found a very sinful hockey player. But I want to share one other story about my brother. So I have one brother who's 2 years older than me. His name is Ian. And if you were to see both of us, you would never think we're brothers. So he is like 6'3", 6'4", big, burly dude. Like, imagine a Viking. It's like, not only that, but imagine a Viking at a Vikings game with no shirt on, with a big V painted on his chest, being very boisterous with a massive goatee. Like, that's my brother. It's always been him. But my brother and I, we had very different childhoods growing up. For me, like, school came easily, like sports came easily. I was often, like the captain of the team. And my brother struggled with school, struggled with sports. And I think because of that, naturally, I was popular or had friends, and then he surrounded himself with people who would accept him, which led to drugs, which led to alcohol, which led to a very, rough life. And my brother, he got, married, moved to Montana, and then he got divorced, and then was living with my dad. Well, long story short, he was at rock bottom, and he started coming to church. Started coming to Eagle Brook. And what I love about Eagle Brook is, and in a lot of our churches, is when he started coming, he felt at home, right? Didn't feel judged, didn't feel like he wasn't welcome. And he put his faith in Christ. And again, when he put his faith in Jesus, his values were still messed up, right? He had a lot of bad habits, still smoked, still drank, still cussed like a sailor. That all just didn't stop overnight. But we wanted to help teach him to obey. What does it look like to follow Jesus? Well, I remember the first thing he did is he started, he joined a small group. So he's in this small group with people. And one day I get a call from my brother, and he's like, "Aaron," I'm like, "What's up, man?" He goes, "I'm in an ambulance on my way to the hospital." I'm like, "You're what?" He's a carpenter. He's like, "Yeah, I'm building a deck. I was building a deck, and I just cut a bunch of my fingers off." So I'm on my way to the hospital. I'm like, "What hospital?" And then he told me, and I was like, "All right, do you want me to come there?" He's like, "If you want." So I get to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, his entire small group was already there. That's the body of Christ. And then I say, "I'm his brother," and I went back there, and he was like, "Look it." And his finger was just hanging by a thread, and I don't want to make any of you pass out. But his whole small group was there. And then he started serving. What was interesting is he started serving on the baptism celebration team. So like, people would be baptized and come out of the water, and my brother, again, like, imagine someone with no shirt being like, "Whoa," like screaming and cheering. Well, one day during our summer baptism, I go there with my brother. I'm the pastor, going to be baptizing people outdoor in the lake, and he was going to serve cheering for people. And as we were walking to the water, he was just like, I think I should be baptized. I'm like, "Man, whenever you're ready, you can do it." At this point, he's been serving for a couple years on the baptism team, and he's never been baptized. And then he puts his arm around me, and he was like, "Brother, do you want to baptize me?" I'm like, "Absolutely." So I get to baptize my brother, and I want to show you this picture. First of all, didn't I describe him perfectly? So there's my brother coming out of the water cheering, but my favorite is this next picture. The smile on his face. So now my brother, you're right, he's been baptized, he's serving, he's in a small group. He meets a girl named Stacy, who is part of our church. They get married, and I got to do their wedding. And I remember at their wedding, I had a joke in the message. I was like, Stacy, when Ian first met you, and I was just like, tell me about her. Isn't she amazing? And Ian came up to me. He's like, oh, Aaron, she's a perfect 8. Because he only has 8 fingers, right? Come on, it was gold. And here's the thing with my brother. And here's the thing about lost people, right? They're on a spiritual journey, okay? And it's messy. So I get done marrying my brother. They walk the aisle. And then all of a sudden they go, hey, close family members and friends, come downstairs. We have something to share with you. And we get downstairs, and they're like, we're pregnant. And I'm like, you're so close. Like, couldn't you have waited a couple, it was, so it's like, yay, we're excited for you, but come on, you're so close. But you're kind of going up to the right a little bit, but and at that point, my brother, he still smoked. And he wanted to quit, and he tried everything. He's been to classes, patches, or whatever. And I remember one day he calls me, and he calls me. He's like, Aaron, I'm done smoking. And I'm like, I've heard this 1,000 times, right? And he was like, no, I'm on my way to work. And the worship song came on. It's your breath in my lungs, so I pour out my praise. He was like, I was singing that while I was smoking, and I said, God, I want your breath in my lungs, not this cigarette. So he's like, so I took my whole carton of cigarettes and I chucked them out the window. And I'm like, you're so close. You got a litter? You turn around and pick them up. And he hasn't smoked now in like 5 or 6 years. That's the power of God, right? And now they have 2 beautiful girls, Rosie and Aria. And my brother's still not perfect. I'm still not perfect. But that's the gospel, right? And I don't know about you, but I want to be a part of a church that's about reaching the 18-year-old sinful hockey players, the very broken Ians of the world. And I'm sure we all have stories we could tell. So the big question as I continue this is how? So if our mission as a church is to go and make disciples, right, to reach them because God loves them, and to help them become a disciple and believe these core beliefs we would die for, then how do we do that? How do we do that? And the cool thing is, there's no prescription of how. And I also think the how can and should look differently wherever you are. So whatever culture you're in, whatever context you're in, whatever city or community you're in, part of what God wants us to know is to know our area to best accomplish everything underneath this dotted line. Because what we say at Eaglebrook is everything under this line, this never changes. Like, our mission will never change. Our purpose will never change, to love God and love others. Our values will never change. We've reworded them. It used to be called the 5 Gs. Like grace, growth, groups. It was clever, but clear is better than clever. And then we also realized groups is not a value. Groups is a strategy. People connected in community is the value. So this is strategies. So everything under that dotted line never changes. Everything above this line is always changing. So strategies are, how do you accomplish the mission? How do you live out the purpose? And how do you make your values the things you say you really believe in? The marks of a disciple. If you're like, we're about making disciples, we'll clarify, well, what does that mean? What does a disciple look like? And strategies are now, how are you going to do that? And if there's something to write down, it would be this: strategies make values a reality. Strategies are what make what you value a reality. So if you say, we value living generously, then as a church, right, as leaders of a church, you're asking, now what strategies do we have in place? What strategies or ministries or teachings do we have to help people actually live generously? Right? Strategies make values a reality. And everything we do, everything you do is just a strategy. And I think just is an important word there. And it's powerful when you create a culture that can say, this is just a strategy. When COVID hit, most churches in America lost the number one strategy. Many of them had to shut down. And now it was like, well, what do? We don't have our main strategy anymore. And what's powerful when we had this is we were able to say our mission isn't changing, right? Everything under that line isn't changing. Now, how are we going to think of a new strategy to make our values a reality at our church? And a lot of decisions that were made during that time, not everybody agreed with. But people were able to say, I don't agree with how we're going to do it, or, mask or no mask. Remember that? It's like, temp check, no temp check. Do we do 6 feet? Right? It was just chaos. No one agreed with the decisions that were made, but we were able to have a culture that said, you know what? I know our leadership is all about everything under this, and this is just a strategy, so let's try it. Right? Strategies make values a reality. But what we've learned is we need a strategy for how to create strategies. Because like Dale said, every church has a Bert and Gladys. Right? How many times do you have people who genuinely, I don't want to talk poorly about them, but they love Jesus, they love the church, and God places something on their heart. Right? And they come to you as the church, the leader, and it's like, oh, pastor, I have such a great idea. Like, I just bought a new Harley, and I've realized that Harley people don't know Jesus, and we need a Harley Davidson ministry. So I think if the church loves God, the church needs a Harley Davidson ministry. And if you don't have that, then you're doing something wrong, right? There's this unreached people group. And then what they're really saying is, you need to do something about it. You need to staff it, you need to put energy into it, and you also need to have the budget for it. And, right, so then what do you do with that? So many churches in America say, that's okay, let's do it. And now they're proud of having 600 different strategies. And now you have a problem because then you're not doing anything well, right? So we've learned we need a strategy filter to create, like, what do we say yes to? What do we say no to? And with every strategy we have, how do we, like, what should the elements look like? The first thing is, does it pass through this filter? So that looks like this. I think on page 15, if you look at 3 circles. We kind of stole this idea from the book Good to Great, Jim Collins. He calls it a hedgehog, but that can get confusing, so don't think of it that way. It's like, this is a filter, and really it's looking at every strategy the church does should ask these 3 questions. It's like, okay, what are we best at? What are we most passionate about? And what does success look like? So, if you have a kids ministry, right? A kids ministry, the room, right? Everything is just a strategy. What we're doing right now is a strategy. It's just a strategy to help other churches. And we're always changing it. But we have a filter for everything we do. So it's like, what are we really best at? Or, I don't know if you can see that. Or what do we want to be best at? And we firmly believe the church should be best at relevance. Not necessarily just our church, but every church. When we do something, it should be relevant. Because we have the most relevant truth that we can speak. Now, I know that relevance is this word in the church culture, right? If you read blogs and podcasts and books, it's kind of becomes a taboo word where it's I don't know about relevant. Let's not be relevant. Let's be, countercultural, or, let's not be excellent. Let's be authentic. And we always put an or when there should be an and. So let me explain what we mean by relevant. Okay? Relevance for us is how do we take a never-changing gospel truth and communicate it to an ever-changing culture that helps change culture. So relevance isn't let's become culture. Relevance is how do we communicate the truth to our culture today in a way that can influence them and this culture. Does that make sense? And the other question I was asked, what's the opposite of relevant? Irrelevant. Imagine if we marketed this leadership training, come to the most irrelevant thing around church leadership. We're not even going to talk about it. It won't apply to your life, right? So we want everything we do to be relevant. If we're having a student ministry, we want the space, the environment, the games, the teaching to be relevant to 6th graders and 11th graders. Same with kids, same with adults. If we're doing a small group thing, we want it to be relevant to our culture today on how it looks like. But the other thing we've learned is we can't be relevant for everybody. So we kind of have this is a little bit, arbitrary, so don't think too much into it. But we kind of have this, we call it the 80-20, where we know we cannot be relevant to 100% of the people. That at some point you have to decide as a church, what is our worship going to look like? Right? What's music going to look? What's the flow of the service? What is the preaching style? And we know that there's a good portion of people that are going to walk through our doors of our church and hate it. They're going to be I don't like the music. Give me some more organ and hymns, or I don't like the way you teach and preach. We just know we can't be relevant to everybody. And most of the time, the 20% is the elephant. Most of the time, it's people who come in and they're overly churched people who have their preferences, and their preference is more important than the purpose and the mission. So when I was a campus pastor, I would hear all the time, the music is too loud. And honestly, because of the clarity, I'm able to be well, I'm not going to go up to the sound guy and say, turn it down because Steve over here thinks it's too loud. It's making me deaf. Technically, it's not, but it's you listen to them and you love them, or why is there so much fog? First of all, it's not fog, it's haze. It's burning my eyes. I'm allergic to it. Scientifically, no, you're not. And it's without haze, how are you going to see the Holy Spirit? I mean, come on. So, right? So it's just people, not everyone's going to love it. And when you have clarity over here's who we are and here's how we define what's relevant, you're able to actually easily say no and lead through those things without feeling you have to change everything because of every piece of input. Okay, so is it relevant? So we want to be best at relevant. Everything we create, we want it to be relevant to our culture, our community. And that looks different. Our EBA, we're going to Norway in February. Church looks way different there. I'm going to Ethiopia in March. We're going to Brazil in May. It's relevance is way different. But you got to know your culture. The next question is passionate. What are you passionate about? What's your greatest passion? We landed on transformation. Right? So every ministry or strategy we do, we don't want it to just be relevant. If it's just relevant, we've missed. We want it to be relevant and transformational. Right? We could create a very relevant student event, but if it's not transformational, then we're just, right, a concert. And we've missed. So transformational, right? Our greatest passion is transformation. Well, and then that begs the question, well, what does that mean? So on page 16, there's the 4 circles of transformation. And like most things, we stole this from someone at some point. They're kind of like 4 circles of transformation. So when we think of our people, even when I think of me, my story, my brother's story, your story, the first circle are people who are exploring their faith. Right? These are explorers. And I can think of a few different categories of explorers. And at one point, we're all explorers. Everyone is an explorer at one point. So, I can think of like a few categories. This isn't exhaustive, but the first category I can think of is the never churched. So this was me. People who have never been to church, right? They just didn't grow up in a family. They didn't go to church. And for whatever reason, something happens in their life. They buy some Left Behind books or whatever. And now they're like, I'm going to start to explore this faith, this Jesus thing, right? And then they step into your church and they know nothing, right? They've never been to church. So when we say things like, or when we assume they just know, hey, we're going to worship the blood of the Lamb. They're like, what? Like, we believe weird things when you think of it, and we'll talk about this later on Friday, when you think of the context of a first-time guest who has never been to church and knows nothing about Jesus. We have to keep them in mind. The second type of explorer is the been churched. We all probably know people who, if you're saying, hey, come to church with me or let's talk about Jesus, their answer is, I will never go back because I've been to church. I've been to church, man. There's no way I'm stepping foot in a church again. What's the new term? Church hurt? There's a lot of church hurt. As a youth pastor, as the central director of student ministries for 4 years, I was so blown away and so heartbroken at the statistics. Once you get in, have you guys heard of Ministry Safe? Man, we had to do Ministry Safe training, like how do you protect your kids against all this abuse and everything, and every volunteer we train up in that. When I first heard I was in awe of how many youth have been hurt or abused at church. Right? And it's like, now they've grown up and they're like, I'm never going back because I've been to church. But for whatever reason, they're now in your church again. Right? They're exploring their faith. They're exploring something. The third category is overly churched. Right? These people, it's like, there are a lot of people who grew up in church, but church is a religion. It's not a relationship. We have a lot of these in Minnesota, right? Lutheran, Catholic. We have so many people who, like, when we hear their story, they'll get baptized and they'll tell their story. And they'll say, I grew up in church my whole life, but I've never known Jesus. So this whole personal relationship thing, this salvation thing, that's new to me. It's like church to me was rules, but now it's about relationship with Jesus. And for whatever reason, they start exploring. The go-to-church people, the Creasters, Christmas and Easter, it's family tradition. We go to church every now and then. So what we keep in mind is, okay, they are coming to church, and everyone's exploring at some point. So how are we speaking to them when they come on Christmas and Easter? How do we take the message of Christmas and the message of Easter, something they've heard every year for 20 years, because they only come, think about it, every time they come to church on Christmas, it's the same story. Every time on Easter, it's the same story. And the hardest thing as a preacher is like, how do you take that story and make it fresh? without getting away from the story, right? But they're there, and they're exploring. And number 5 is the healthy church. I have 2 boys now, 4 and a half, 2 and a half. And I want nothing more than for them to grow up as a healthy churched family. And hopefully that's your story. We want that to be the story of every child who grows up in our ministries, where they grow up and they have a healthy balance between, hey, church is a priority in this family. Like, we're never going to neglect meeting together. We're going to serve. We're going to be a part of this. And church is our church. It's not dad's job. It's not just dad's church. This is our family, right? It's our family church, and we're going to make that a priority. But at the same time, we're going to have a relationship with Jesus. We're going to pray together as a family. We're going to read our Bibles. I'm going to get choked up. I'm the dude. My wife laughed at our wedding, and I was in tears, okay? So I'm a softie. Every time we're watching TV, she'll look over, and she'll be like, "Are you crying?" And I'm like, "No." What? He just caught the ball. We're watching Sandlot, right? And I'm bawling. So that's me. Just a little heads up over there over the next few days. But I remember I woke up in the morning, and it was like, I like to get up early. It was like 5 o'clock, and I quietly go downstairs not to wake my kids up. I pour a cup of coffee, and I'm like, take the first sip, and sure enough, I hear dum, 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 coming down the stairs. I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. My 4-year-old comes around, Dad. I'm like, what are you doing awake? Go to sleep. Go back to bed. You shouldn't be up. I just want to be with you. I'm like, well, if you're going to be with me, I'm going to go downstairs, and I'm going to work out and read my Bible. He's like, okay. So I go downstairs, and I'm doing a workout, and it's so cute. He tries to do it with me. He'll be doing push-ups. I'm like, dude, looks like never mind. Those aren't push-ups. And then we're reading the Bible, and it was so cute. He I sit down, and he turns off all the bright lights, turns off the other one. He calls it mood lighting. He's 4. And he goes, Dad, I'll be right back. I'm like, where are you going? I'm going to run up to my room. I'm like, no, you're going to wake up your brother and your mom and everyone's sleeping. Just, be quiet. And he comes back down, and he's got his Bible. And he sits next to me, and he's like, for 30 minutes, he's just looking at the pictures, and I didn't intentionally do that. I was like, oh my gosh, as a father, that was just, it makes me cry. It's like, but this is the gift, right? He's exploring, and I want him to grow up in this type of environment. But at some point, everybody, including us, we have to face the cross, right? The cross of Jesus. We hear the gospel. This was me at that Pentecostal church in Reamer. It's like, am I going to make Jesus my Lord? Am I going to admit that I have sinned, that I'm a sinner, and I need a Savior, and I'm going to follow Him with my life, right? And I think that this is the cross of salvation, where we die to sin. Where we die, we're still a sinner. We sin all the time. We still have a sin nature, but it's like, I am no longer a sinner by identity. I am a child of God. I am forgiven, right? And I'm going to live out of this place of forgiveness, out of this place of, here's what Jesus has done. And I become a new believer. This was me. This was my brother. I'm new. What does this mean? What does it mean to be a disciple? What is it, how should I live? How do I please God or honor God or glorify God by my words, by my actions, by my thoughts, all of these things that take forever for us to grow in. They're new. And what we're doing as a church is we're constantly going, okay, what are explorers dealing with? And now when we're, again, thinking through strategies, we know everything we create, there are new believers there. How are we helping them grow? How are we helping them become transformed? And one thing we're learning, so if you have the answer to this, let us know, is forever, right? We'll have weekends, we'll have this year Like I think last year, 8,000 people at our church alone put their faith in Jesus. So it's like unbelievable, right? That's our mission. But now we have 8,000 new believers. What strategies do we have to help them take a next step and grow and get engaged? So we're constantly asking, like, how do we take someone who just put their faith in Jesus? Step one, how do we get them to let us know that they've put their faith in Jesus so that we can give them everything that we have to help them grow and take a step? So we've done over the years new believers things. Like, hey, if you're a new believer, come to the new believer small group. Or here's a new believer's guide. And we still have that. But what we're learning is most new believers don't want to call themselves new believers. They don't self-identify as a new believer. And what we get a lot is a 40, 50-year-old person who says, I've always believed. I'm just now like a new follower. Do you know what I mean? So most new believers don't want to show up to a new believer thing. Do you guys have that struggle of like new believers aren't showing up to new believer things? You know, new believers aren't going to the new believer small group? And quite frankly, what the feedback we're getting is, if I'm a new believer, I don't want to be in a room with a bunch of other people that don't know what they're talking about. Right? It's so strategically, let's get new believers in with mature believers so they can grow together. So we're trying to figure out, right? We're constantly asking, is it working? How do we help new believers spend time with God, right? Live generously, serve others, connect in community. Over time, new believers become, we'll just call this bucket growing. They're starting to really grow in their faith. And in this bucket, what we see is people who, maybe it's, they're in this bucket for 3 to 5 years, but I don't want to put a timeline on it because some people are stuck in this circle for 30 years. Where people in this circle, this is almost like the elephant Dale's talking about, right? They come to know Jesus. They're passionate about the church. They're excited to grow and learn. And now they get involved. And now they've checked every box, right? They're like, you want me to spend time with God? I'm doing all these Bible reading plans. I've downloaded YouVersion. You should see my streak. They're in a small group. They're serving like every weekend. Sometimes you're like, can you take a weekend off? But, they're maybe giving. But it's almost like the values are a checkbox. And these people almost get stuck because the church they once loved, they now realize, oh, you're not perfect. And you're messy. And you make mistakes. And now God starts to put something on their heart, and now they become passionate about other things. And they're good things. And now they're the ones going, why aren't you doing church? A, B, C, and D. And it's almost like we've learned people, they hit another wall in their transformation journey. And I'll just say the fourth circle here, these are truly Christ-centered people. But there's a wall between most believers in our churches and truly Christ-centered people. And this wall is really, really, really hard to get over. And oftentimes, even we go back and forth between the two. So what's the wall? The wall is almost like a second cross, but not the cross of salvation, right? That's been done for us. It's the cross of surrender, where you realize I have to die to self daily. When Jesus says, if any of you want to be my follower, you must you must give up your own way. You must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Think of like a marriage, right? Every day you have to wake up and you have to die to self. You have to give up your way for the sake of others. And I think that's the difference. So to become a Christ-centered person, Christ-centered people, they realize it's not about me. That when I go to church, when I'm church shopping, the question I shouldn't be asking is, what are you doing for me? Are you, church, feeding me? Are you helping me grow? What are you doing for me? And a lot of people, when they're stuck here, they love our church, and now you realize, oh, where are you? You don't go to our church anymore. You go to a different church. Yeah, I left your church because it's just not feeding me anymore. It's a big one. It's not feeding me anymore. They're stuck in the third circle because it's all about them. And oftentimes it's the preferences. It's people who are like, I don't like the music, so I'm going to go somewhere else for the music I like. Who's it about? Them. It's not about the mission. They've forgotten the purpose because it's just about them. They love a strategy more than they love the mission. And this is happening all over the place. And I think one of the reasons why 80% of churches are plateaued or declining is, yes, they've forgotten the purpose, but I even think they know the mission, right? They may even know the purpose, but they're unwilling to change a strategy. And they will die for a strategy over wanting to reach their neighbor. We have these people at our church, Dan and Marlene Jensen, mid-80s. I met with Dan every week, every Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. for like 4 or 5 years. I would go to his townhome. He'd make me one piece of toast, some butter, some jelly. It was all ready when I got there, cut in half. Some of the greatest times. And we would just hang out and chat. And Dan and Jensen have been going to our church since dinosaurs. I don't know. They've been around forever. And when you ask Dan and Jensen, it's like, why do you still come to Eaglebrook? A lot of their peers years ago left, right? As soon as we changed the music, as soon as we, painted the walls, got rid of the pews, they left. And when you ask them the question, they start tearing up. And their answer is like, yeah, I don't love the music. It's too loud. Now, he actually is like, I actually like it because I can actually hear it. But he gets choked up, and he's like, I go to our church because every weekend I look down the aisle, and I see my kids, and my grandkids, and my great-grandkids, and my great-great-grandkids in the kids ministry. And oftentimes, it's my grandkids who are reminding my kids that they better be in church. He's like, I go to this church because they serve on the after prayer team. He's like, every week on the after prayer team, I get to pray with people who are putting their faith in Jesus for the first time. I get to pray with people who are like, when I showed up, I remember one example. He's like, this couple came up and they're like, we're done. Our marriage is over. They came for after service prayer and they're like, because of what God did here this weekend, we're gonna stick it out. He's like, that's why. He's like, yeah, I could go down the street to my country club. It's not why Jesus died. Jesus didn't distance himself from sinners. He died for them. And we should die for our preferences for the sake of the mission. Love that. So we're constantly looking at our strategies. In every strategy, we're trying to say, how do we help all of these people move? And how do we help even Christ? Because Christ-centered people, they love explorers. They love explorers. And we're going to talk a lot about, even tomorrow, about change. Because once you have a vision, now you need to change, and church people hate change. How do you lead through that? And a lot of it, it's these people. And what's really hard is a lot of these people think they're Christ-centered. All right. Relevance, transformation, and the last one, how do we define success? In other words, how do we know if it's working? Ownership. Ownership is the word we've come up with. So everything we do, we're saying, is it relevant to the audience that we're trying to do this ministry or strategy for? Is it transformational? In other words, is it helping people grow in their faith and specifically help them transform and grow in one of the 5 values, the marks of a disciple? And the third filter is it building ownership in the people? So let me explain, because it's kind of hard to understand what we mean by ownership. We want people to own their own faith, yes. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about, is it helping our church own the vision culture, right? The mission, the purpose, the values. So to give you an example, when I first became the student ministry or director, in Minnesota, our programming is from the fall, like from September to May, and then we would take all summer off from like weekly student ministries, right? They're not in school and they're kind of all over the place. So what we were doing is we were just doing a bunch of fun things. Like we would go to Valley Fair. So for high school, we had this Valley Fair day. So Valley Fair, it's kind of like Six Flags, right? It's this big amusement park. And at that point, normally we had about 1,000 students coming out, high school students coming on a Wednesday night. And every year, summer, when we would do Valley Fair, we maybe would get 100 high schoolers to show up. Maybe 100. But it was so much work because we'd rent all these buses and they would come and we would bus them there and it'd be an all-day thing and we would get to Valley Fair and we'd basically be like, go and try not to sin or die and have fun, and we would have unchurched people come, right? These students who have never come to our church would come with their friend. They would go enjoy Valley Fair. We'd be like, okay, let's meet, and we're going to grill some hot dogs and maybe share a Bible verse over lunch, and then go have fun again and don't do anything stupid, and then try to be back at this time. And then all the time in student ministries, it's like we're always late. Their parents are waiting 30 minutes for us to get back at church. Now they're mad, and it's like we started to ask the question, is this actually relevant? In other words, is this event attracting at least 80% of the students we already have? No. Is it transformational? Is it helping students grow in their faith strategically and intentionally? No. Is it fun? Sure. Can you say, well, there's some relationships happening. Yeah, great. But the big one is ownership. It's like we're challenging our students who come to church every Wednesday night to invite their non-church friends to an amusement park. And the ones who come to the amusement park, does it mean because they're at an amusement park with their friends that they will ever step foot into our church ever? No, it doesn't. And it doesn't work when you actually measure the metrics. So we said, well, why are we doing that? Why are we wasting so much time and money on this thing we've just done for years because we've always done it, when it's not actually accomplishing anything except for fun? So we had to rethink it, and we rethought this whole event. We're like, all right, let's have this event where, we bus all the students. We'll call it a Rev event. It's this one-day thing at one of our campuses from, 10 in the morning till 10 p.m. Tons of games, fun, and we'll do a full, worship, gospel message, and then we'll have food, and then in the evening we'll do more fun, and then we'll have another, more worship and another, gospel message, and give students a chance to put their faith in Jesus. And since we've been doing that, we've started to see 600, 700, 800 students come. And the ownership piece is they got to invite their unchurched friends to church where they got to experience what we actually do and be exposed to the 5 values, right? And we got to say to them, hey, by the way, in 1 month on this day, come back because we do this every single week. They got to experience a small group, fun, worship, games, right? We would work in serving things, where they would bring shoes, fill up, we got to have them grow in all 5 of the values. And my favorite story is there's this one student who came in the morning, broke his femur, went to the hospital, got a cast put on it, and his mom's like, all right, well, let's go home. And he was like, I want to go back to church. And then he came back to church that night, and that night he put his faith in Jesus for the very first time. And the last cohort we did, his mom was in the back. She was like, that was my son. And I'm like, really? I'm like, that's true, right? She's like, yes, that's exactly what happened. And it's like that, right? It was relevant to high school students. It was transformational, and it built ownership in both the students inviting their friends to church and ownership in the students to then really experience what is this all about. Does that make sense? So those are the kind of questions we're asking with strategies. So strategies, they make values a reality. So the question I have for you guys is, when you work on this, do you have a strategy filter? And the other piece is, are you clear on your values? Because if you're not clear on what your values are, right, the outcome of everything you do, how you define a disciple, then you're doing strategies just to do strategies. So what we've had to go through is a stop doing list to say there are a lot of strategies we just need to stop doing. And it's hurtful, it's painful, but then you have more energy for what you should be doing. And it's really hard to rethink all those, because it's the last thing I'll say about it. Behind every strategy is a person who created that strategy and thought about that strategy. So it's hard. It's hard, but it's totally worth it. Okay, the last one. Goals. Goals. So who, what, why, how. Goals, it's kind of that, well, where are we going? When are we going to get there? The where and when. Practically speaking, I think how I see it, the questions we really ask with goals is it working? And how do we know? Is it working, and how do we know? So we can look at our kids' ministry, our groups ministry, and say, is this thing working? Really? Yeah, it's working. Well, how do we know? Really? How do you know? Well, the same 8 people are coming every week. Okay. Is it really working then? Now, here's where I think this framework, this vision culture, on a day-to-day, week-to-week, like church leadership aspect comes into play. Goals and strategies and values are very interconnected. Goals, strategies, and values. When you're very clear on your values, so for example, connecting community. We want to help our people connect in community with other people. Great. Now we're asking, how are we going to do that? And for years at Eagle Brook, we had small groups. And here's how small groups looked. We even had a web page, groups finder, go on there, affinity groups, the whole deal, right? Which maybe a lot of you have. And what we realized, at least in Minnesota, in our culture, when someone goes online to sign up for a small group, there's no start, there's no end date. So they would sign up, they would get reached out by someone they've never met to go to a house that they've never been, to meet people that they don't even know if they're weird or not. They are weird. We're all weird. Everyone's weird. And then once they start the small group, there's no end to the small group. So it's like we're asking people to sign up to a group of people they've never met for their entire life. And now, half the time, our groups pastor, what they're doing is they're trying to figure out what groups actually exist and which ones don't, because they just sort of like awkwardly dissolve, right? It's like, does your group meet? Yeah? Still? Okay? It's like all of that. And then we've noticed that, because we had a goal, let's just say our goal is like we want 5,000 people to be in small groups this year. Because last year, we had 3,000. So how do we get more people? We've noticed every year the number of people in groups was going down. The value didn't change, but now what are we asking? Is it working? No. How do we know? Well, we have goals and we're not meeting them, and metrics don't lie. So for the sake of the value, let's think of a new strategy that's relevant, transformational, and builds ownership. So we rethought our whole group's strategy, and now we have, what do we call them, Jen? There's a start date and an end date. Semesters. So now we have, it's like we can, as a whole church, we can build up, hey, on this day, sign up for a group, and then they'll meet every week for 9 weeks. And there's a start date and an end date, and then we strategically work in, if you like these people you're with, you can continue meeting, right? And people can continue to sign up, but there's a very clear start and end. And the first year, we saw 60% growth of people saying, I can sign up for 6 weeks or 9 weeks to try this, that they were connected in community with other people, right? So it's just a stretch. The value is connecting community. How you do that is just a strategy. So don't be afraid to kill a strategy to start to try a new one. But sometimes you need to give strategies enough time to actually work. So yeah, goals. Is it working? How do we know? So I was at a church. They invited us there because after this we do a vision culture review. So it's like, hey, present to us kind of your version. And they were a great church, and they had all this stuff laid out. And what I noticed is they showed me all of their values. Like, these are great values. Here's some feedback on how you can word it to make them more action-oriented. And then they said, here are all of our strategies for the next year and for the next 3 years and the next 5 years. And then here are our goals. Here's our 1-year goal, our 5-year goal, our 10-year goal. None of the goals were directed to connected to any strategy, and none of the strategies were connected to any of the values. They were completely separate. Now, it seems simple, but oftentimes it's not. If we really audited what we're doing, can we connect every strategy and ask, what value is this making a reality in the lives of our people? So we have numeric goals for all of our strategies. So follow Jesus. We have a goal this next year at Eaglebrook. How many people followed Jesus last year? Now, how many people do we want to see follow Jesus for the very first time this year? And we always want to make it higher. And oftentimes we never reach our goal, but that's not the point, right? The point is it kind of keeps you motivated for what really matters. How many people do we want in groups? How many people do we want serving this year? How many new people do we want to see living generously this year? We strategically create strategies that are relevant, transformational, and build ownership. It sounds simple, but it's hard to simplify, right? So here's a practical thing that I've been in a lot of meetings where we've thrown this up on kind of the walls. And under this, we have put follow Jesus, spend time with God, connect in community, serve others, live generously. And we've tried to put ourselves in the shoes of people in each one of these circles and say, what strategies do we have to help them grow? Explorers. If Explorer comes to our church, what strategies do we have to help them take a next step in one of these values? Same thing with new believers. Same thing with those stuck in circle 3. And then Christ-centered people. Christ-centered people, it looks a little different, but it's a very practical exercise that we're always doing those things. So if you have any questions, you can either ask them, write them down. We'd love to dialogue about this. On page 17, you're going to see what we call a scoreboard. This is for our goals. This is how we measure. So every single month, that's updated. So our leadership, ministries, campuses, we always know the numbers that align with our values. Those are the ultimately things we measure. And right in the middle is salvations for us. Because that's ultimately the mission that we're trying to get after. All right, so on page 18, we have this language we've adopted at our church called protect the banks of the river. Protect the banks of the river. So if you think of a river, rivers have momentum, right? And the older the river that has the more momentum, what does it do? It has banks to the river. And the higher the banks, typically the stronger the current. And as a church, it's like we want momentum. Like what would it look like if everybody at our church, all of our staff, all of our volunteers, whatever that looks like in your context and your size, what if we were all flowing with momentum in the same direction for what really, really, really matters? Right? So that's what we'll often say, we need to protect the banks of our river. Because what happens is we always have people who are trying to chip away at the banks of the river. These are the people with their ideas, their preferences, the what if. I know we've had a board member once, like years ago, who have said, I know our mission is empowered by God to reach people for Christ, but haven't we reached enough people? We had a pastor who came through the Eagleburg Association training and went back and worked really hard to try to get his church to get on mission. And his board, they all got together and they're like, if you want to be a part of a church that's about reaching lost people, then you should go to a church that wants to do that. And they fired him. Because he was excited about the mission. So we always have people that are wanting to chip away at the banks, and this happens slowly. Hey, pastor, can we have budget for this thing, and a budget for this thing, and a budget for this thing? And now you have things happening all the time, and your budget's getting spread thin, your staff is getting spread thin, and it's chipping away at the momentum and the clarity. So by protecting the banks of the river, it's like we always train pastors, one of the words you're going to get really good at is saying no. No. Great idea. No. Great idea. No. Now we're training them to say, hey, you want to do a horseback riding ministry? Man, that's awesome. Let me connect you with our groups, pastor. And we will train you to start that. If you're passionate about that, right, we're not going to have a softball league that we're doing, but if you want to do that, go do that. We'll help you do that, but that's on you, right? We're going to empower you to do that, and then you really start to see, do they really want to do that or not? So what are the banks of the river? For us, it's the vision culture and the hedgehog. And this comes out in language. That's great. That's not our mission. I love that they're doing that. It's just not our mission. We used to have a whole department called Global where we would organize, and we had staff that would organize and do all of our own mission trips. And then we realized, what if we partnered with people who do mission trips that are really good at that's what they do, right? And it helped us get rid of that department and then filter all of our people to an organization that does that really well. We still love the value, right? But now it's not chipping away at the banks of our river. So protect the banks of your river. It's super, super important. And then the last thing I want to share with you is this on page 19, and then we'll get to lunch. Benefits of a vision culture. I'm going to give you 5 words that having a vision culture has helped us tremendously. And we have seen help hundreds of churches who actually take the time to use this framework and do it, right? And either get rid of some of the old stuff you already have, or like Rock Point, hey, we have a lot of these things, but man, let's plug them into this framework because it's clarity. This is clarity. So it gives us clarity. Nobody at Eaglebrook, and I think, again, hate sharing numbers because it's not about us, and I don't want you to think of it like that. But it's like, I think we have close to 500 people on staff. So it's like, to have that many people, the biggest threat to our church is a drift from the vision culture. But what's amazing about it right now is like, nobody from the top down ever wonders, what do you do? What is your mission? Why do you do it? Why do we exist? Who are we trying to become? What do we believe? There's immense clarity. The second is language. Cultures are built on language. That's why there's multiple different languages. And when you have common language within a culture, it is powerful. So what vision culture helps with us is saying things like, hey, that's just a strategy. Hey, let's think of a new strategy for this. Hey, if you want to take a next step, one of our values here at Eaglebrook is to, serve others. Let's figure out how you can do that. You know what? I love that you're passionate about that theology idea, but we're just not going to die for that here. In fact, we'll discuss it. We're not even going to defend it. Why do you have women pastors and teachers? Hey, it's just one of our defend beliefs. I disagree. That's great that you disagree. And you know what the difference between defend and discuss? Discuss is really fun, and we should. Actually, it's an act of worship, right? Theology, to talk about those things. But defend is not only do we believe it, but we put it into practice. Believer's baptism. We believe that, and we have to practice it. Then it's a defend. And die for is if it's something else, it's not Christian, right? You're talking about a different religion. I had this moment where me and then I hired a high school teaching pastor. We were going to do a series on a book of the Bible. I'm not going to reveal any details here because some of you guys are going to start thinking. And when we got to this book of the Bible, we were like, hey, how are we going to teach these 4 weeks and split it up? We realized how he interprets the entire book, that entire book of the Bible, was drastically different than how I interpreted that whole thing. And in a lot of churches, that would have blown up. But we had language to say, this is a discuss thing. We're not going to die for this. We're not even going to defend this. So let's figure out how to do this together because there's room for us to discuss it. How old is the earth? I don't know. But what I'll die for is there's one God who created all things and all people. Who created? God. How did he create it? When did he create it? Are you pre-trib, post-trib, amillennial? I don't know. Okay, I'll move on. Language is, if you're like me, for those of you who've gone to seminary, I graduated seminary more humble than convicted. Like, I don't know. Okay, unity. When you have clarity in language, now you have unity. And one of the things Jesus prayed for is unity. You're not divided over so many things. You're very unified on the things that matter the most. We still have differences, opinions, tensions, struggles, conflict, all of that, but we're able to have the language to put them in their proper place. Freedom is the fourth one. We have not always had this. 23 years ago, Dale learned the hard way that freedom to just change things wasn't there. But when you have this and you create a culture around it, now we have the freedom to go, that is just a strategy. Let's completely change that because it's not working. But without it, you don't have the freedom because it's your opinion versus my opinion, it's your preference versus my preference. Or you don't have the freedom because you have someone on the board or someone who's been coming for a long time with deep pockets. And you're like, they created that. If we got rid of that, they would leave. And if they left, that would be a huge ding in our budget. Right? But this gives us freedom to change. And then lastly, longevity. The vision culture transcends any person or personality. That is powerful. Too many churches are built around their senior pastor. And when their senior pastor retires, what happens? There's some national search, a search committee, and now they hire a new senior pastor, and everyone on staff and everyone at the church is starting to wonder, what's our new mission going to be? What's the church going to look like? All this kind of stuff. And when you create this as a team, it's never about a person. It's about the mission Jesus gave the church, the purpose, right? The values, the beliefs. And he's actually coming here. Our former senior pastor, Bob Merritt, will be here. We're going to Arizona. He's like, I'll be there. I'll be at Code Arizona. He got here early to golf and everything. But he retired, started with 300 some people, built, just incredible how God used him. He retired March of 2020. So, yeah, let that sink in. So we have his last weekend. He hands the football off to our new senior pastor, who was our teaching pastor for years. So just the senior pastor kind of handoff was incredible, to where he got a standing ovation from our church, and then our new pastor got a standing ovation from our church. So he handed the football off to him. Our new senior pastor got to preach the next weekend to a normal church, and then that week had to cancel services because of COVID. Imagine that. Taken over as the new senior pastor, and then COVID hits, and then he had to lead through that. But my point is, what's powerful is when Jason Strand became our new senior pastor, not a single person in our entire church ever even thought, what's the mission of Eagle Brook going to be? Are our values going to change? Our belief, what's going to change? Not a single person. Because we're not built around a person. And the thing I love the most about Eagle Brook is most people go, oh, what church do you go to? Oh, Eagle Brook. Oh, who's the senior pastor? Because it doesn't matter. Our senior pastors are never, ever, ever about building. They've never been about their own name, their own brand. It's about the mission. And this helps us keep us accountable to that. And we want this for you. So I hope you hear our hearts here. We want this for your church because we've seen the benefits, and we've seen so many churches experience the benefits.